2015, and Irina is currently working on a new book, Common Grounds, a comparative history of early housing estates in Europe, which will be published later this year. Is that still likely? Okay. Funny how things change in a month or two, isn't it? So this evening marks the launch of her latest book, The Autonomy of Theory, Ticino Architecture and its Critical Reception. So following an exhibition in 1975 in Zurich, Recent Architecture in Ticino, a generation of architects working in Ticino in the 60s and 70s attracted huge international attention. In her book and her talk tonight, Irina argues that this critical attention emancipated the narratives of Ticino architecture from the actual conditions of production. Primarily a historiography, Irina's research chronicles the long-term consequences of the misalignment between autonomous theory and situated knowledge. I hope this is all going more or less in the right direction, leading first to the autonomy of architecture from its context, and ultimately to the autonomy of theory from architecture. So, Irina, thank you very much.
Brother.
I'd like to start by thanking you, Simon and Gavin, so much for this incredibly generous gesture. It's been a series of lectures that I've been following from Switzerland, wishing that I could be here for the occasional evening. And to be here is a real pleasure. I'd also like to thank the team of architects who have helped, Jack, old students, and Michael, and Claudia, and Elliot, and a second Jack I heard, who set all the chairs, and everyone who had helped with this organization. I also have to say that this is for me a bit of a first, in that I've talked in bookshops or I talked in universities, and to do it in an architect's office feels like coming full circle. Because this is a book that really refers to, and it's about architects, but it's about how architects are perceived from the outside as well. So one last thing I should say is that I find it incredibly, I never thought that being with an audience of 80% friends, and many friends that I haven't seen in many years, would be so nerve-wracking. I hope that I'll keep things light and quick. I would say about half an hour. I might go into for 40 minutes, but certainly not beyond that, so that you can still like me at the end. Okay. So this is the so-called London launch of a book that's already, at the moment, out of print, but is being reprinted. So there are a couple of copies at the back. It's a very small book, and if you don't get your hands on a copy tonight, you can always get it online as well. So this is part of a series of publications from Verlag, called Edition, that is aimed at extended essays that are not very long. The books are always very small, and they have this double format. It's a hybrid format, so they are not only available online, but you can download them free of charge or read them online. So this is available in case a copy is not to hand. Now, I'm not going to go through each of the chapters. I'm going to roughly follow this structure, but I should say that the way this came about was from an initial interest in an exhibition that took place in Zurich 50 years ago, called Tendenzen, Recent Architecture in Ticino. And this, Cam's head. But this is fantastic because we have Kenneth's shadow on the is a suitable thing. But this is a series of papers that I wrote, kind of weekends, evenings, kind of jobs, normally for conferences that were coming up on a theme, and I was saying, oh, I can turn around this theme of Ticino architecture and its coverage for whatever themes were available. So this created this sort of different angles of looking at a very small, almost micro history. But the introductory chapter is worth going through because it really sets out a thesis of what this is about. This is not a book about Ticino architecture, it's about the paper apparatus that developed around this built architecture and how this paper apparatus projected it on an international scene, and it turned it into what Kenneth Frampton recently calls the Ticino moment. So the first moment in this was this exhibition that I mentioned already, Tendenzen. This took place in a place that was at the time rented by ETH. It's now a supermarket just by the station in Zurich. And it was a very simply put together exhibition. It consisted of about 70 panels, which covered about 50 buildings by about 21 practices from Ticino. Most of them were then young and emerging architects in their 30s or so. So for many years, all we had about the exhibition was this plan and the inventory. Earlier, when I say we had, I mean that these papers were still kept in the Goethe archives where I work. And we had no idea what this exhibition looked like until one of my intrepid colleagues, Luca Chan, found in the paperwork that a team of television crew had come and filmed. So he wrote to the Swiss radio and television company and got a 2-minute film footage of the actual exhibition. So it was with great trepidation that you're some of the first, I guess, 50 people to see these images. But alongside the exhibition itself, there was a small catalog. This catalog is A4 landscape format, and there was an immediate correspondence between the exhibition panels and this reduced format of the catalog. And there was a very clear chicken-egg situation. What came first? Were the pages made to be reductions of the exhibition panels, or the exhibition panels were meant to be blown up versions of the exhibition pages, exhibition catalog? And the answer, looking at lots of material, is that it's actually the catalog that was the primary material for the dissemination of the exhibition. And the panels are actually very, you can imagine from an A4 blowing it up to an A0, so the lines become thick and trembly, and it was a very rough, very immediate exhibition that was taking full advantage of the reprographics techniques of the time. The exhibition was curated by Martin Steinmann, who was then what we now call a postdoc. No, it was not even a postdoc, it was a pre-doc at the GTA Institute. It was an exhibition organized under the aegis of the ETH exhibitions program, which was run by Heinz Ronner. So they were both very active in this. And the third person who was important in this was Thomas Boga, who was the architect hired by the exhibition program to make the exhibition himself. So he was not an intellectual contributor, but he was very involved with the physical material that you see here. What we discovered looking at the various maquettes that we still have in the archive was that the pages of the catalog were organized according to a grid, and the grid was hidden. It's very much, looking at these materials is very much like looking through an analog version of InDesign, where every page, and we have all these different stages of the pages, so the materials that came from the architects were reduced, were photographed and reduced to thumbnails. The thumbnails were distributed on the page. Then the right size would be set, and then we go to print. And in between, there would be also a film negative image of the page that would be produced, which was used for the printing both of the catalog and for the A0 exhibition panel. So this is the negative film of a series of extraordinary drawings by Giancarlo Durisch for his house and atelier in Riva San Vitale, including what he called, the artistic references that he had been using. So 6 of these 18 are drawings that he himself made of the artworks he was referencing. So these made their way on the gridded paper, and then eventually in the catalog and on the exhibition panels. But what is lost is the extraordinary quality of the drawings themselves. So imagine a series of 18 drawings, sort of slightly larger than A2, on transparent paper drawn with pencil. So all these incredible textures that you cannot really see on this image, but you can see every movement of the pencil to create this depth of colors and grays that are not really grays because they're so warm. His childlike writing at the bottom. So there is a huge amount of information that the exhibition excluded or lost in this process, in the reprographics process. So what I'm saying is that there is a parallel between this reprographics process and the loss of information, the loss of doubt, the loss of effort that the original materials had, and the way that, in a certain way, the built architecture is being sort of refracted through the critical process into something that is flattened. It becomes two-dimensional, and because it is flat-packed and is two-dimensional, it can travel, it can be disseminated. So there's always this tension between the built object and its means of dissemination, which are always removed from the reality of the experienced building. Now, this is a very quick rehearsal on what actually this architecture was. Ticino is a canton, the only Italian-speaking canton in Switzerland, in the south, and this red thing does not make it justice. So just to give you a little flavor, this is a typical Ticino image of a small mountain village. You can also see some buildings that are out of scale and quite ugly and quite new. That's also quite typical, unfortunately. And another image that is very typical, and it's actually taken in the 1970s when this architecture was being produced, the other one was December this year, is a condition that becomes clear on this, which is that after the war, Ticino, which had been a predominantly rural, agricultural, remote and poorly connected region, became industrialized. Particularly these flat valleys between the mountains were covered in not only agricultural but light industry. And with that, many people from Ticino who had left returned as professionals, as engineers. The population grew, the income capital grew per person. So there was a process that affected the landscape, and it was at the same time a societal process, and it was a process that affected the architecture in the fact that it produced a lot of demand. And in parallel with this, there was an interesting self-awareness that was beginning to form among the young architects who were working in these conditions. And one of the panels of the exhibition shows an entry to the campus of the EPFL campus, so the big university campus near Lausanne. That was produced by what was described in the competition entry as a Gruppo Ticino. And this consisted, as you can see at the bottom of the page, by Mario Botta, Tita Carloni, Calfetti, Flora Rusciai, and Luigi Snozzi. So names that we normally associate with auteur architects who operated more sort of separately from each other. But at this point, in 1970, in this competition, under the heading Gruppo Ticino, you have these people working together and proposing an architecture. So this is a master planning that has very much a territorial dimension. The idea of creating this cardo and decumanus that are detached from the ground and floating above the ground, and then reorienting the grid of the campus according to the topography. Now, this was in a way a blown up solution from the smaller but built project of the public baths in Bellinzona, which had been authored by Calfetti, Rusciai, and Ivo Trümpi together. Where again, this was a competition from 1967, where you can see a walkway that is raised above the ground that connects the city with the river Ticino, and from here you can walk on this passerelle, or you can go down and then pay your ticket, and then you are in the bath. You can change, and you can access this landscape of different pools. And I'd like to say that it's very much similar now, but these vistas are stopped by new construction. But it still operates in full capacity. But what you have also at this time in Ticino, there's a certain set of typologies of buildings. There was, in the 50s, 60s, the motorway was cut across, and there were sculptural civil engineering works like those of Rino Tami, who was a professor at ETH. Then many Ticinese youngsters who went to ETH to study, and they studied with Rino Tami. Then there were many, as I said, professional families who wanted their own house. And then, because of the population growth, there was also a need for schools. Some of these houses, and I'm really talking about projects that are very well known, discussed a lot in the 70s and 80s. So Reichlin and Reinhardt's Tonini house, that with its Palladian themes, the kind of sniffing around the door of postmodernism offerings of Mario Campi and friends, and a very important program, as I said, for schools, that it shows that the stylistic range was incredibly wide, so it was not like there was a stylistic movement. So Tita Carloni with his late modernist industrial aesthetic for a school in Stabio, Vacchini and Calfetti working together and producing something very Miesian for a high school in Lausanne, and Campi again, Tessin and Piazzoli for a kind of brutalist school. And finally, a lot of restorations, particularly of the historical castles in Bellinzona, but not only that, there were also many houses that were deemed listed, and so there was a lot of restoration as well as another theme. Okay, so having gone through that, let's go back to the exhibition. And the exhibition was very much a reaction to the fact that 2 years earlier there had been an exhibition at ETH in the same space covering the work of Aldo Rossi and John Hayduke. And legend has it that Heinz Ronner, the organizer of this exhibition, on the night of the opening said, "Now it's the time of the Ticinese." And he asked Martin Steinmann, who was having a drink next to him, if he was going to become the curator of this. I think he had Steinmann in his sights, not because he was sitting next to him, but this is how this all started. So they had 2 years to prepare. And why was Rossi very important at this time? He was actually a guest professor at ETH between 72 and 74, so that exhibition had come in the middle of his second year. He was an extremely popular professor that exercised an unbelievable fascination among the students. With his teaching, he had just his publication, the Architettura della Città, had just been translated in German. You see him here together with his assistants. This is Heinrich Helfenstein, who became a very well-known architectural photographer, and Bruno Reichlin, who was an architect and a theorist. Here you can see this is above a facade of the Galaratese, which we're all familiar with, and below a diploma project from Max Boshart, one of his students, which shows how formalistically he was just a copy-paste exercise, more or less. They were absolutely fascinating. But Rossi was actually instilling in the school at this time a design method, which was very programmatic, and he himself, or his chair, was not by itself implementing this, but it was done with the help of many other docente, some of whom were Ticinese. In particular, Luigi Snotti was a very articulate protagonist in this transfer movement. So he was at this point guest docente, guest lecturer at ETH, and you can see this is 11th of December, so maybe 2 weeks after the vernissage of the Rossi Heilig exhibition. Heinz Reuner organizes a meeting with Luigi Snotti, and he asks him, so tell me about Ticino architecture, what is it all about? And based on these notes, you can see that he tells a story, and this story will become a narrative that becomes sort of told over and over again, where he talks about the rationalist influences from the 30s that came from Italy and from people who lived in Ticino, who were German modernists, and then the middle generation, like the people like Lino Tami, who was doing the motorways, but also Alberto Camenzind, who was another professor at ETH, and then the new generation, which is pretty much almost word for word the protagonist of the Tendenzen exhibition. We could give a whole lecture about this paper, but we will not going to do that. And at the same time, you have, for the first time, a purely theoretical reading of this production, which is Martin Steinmann's effort. And he's looking at this work that is very heterogeneous, that covers several programs, several scales, you know, a variety of styles, and he says, okay, the only thing that they have in common is an architectural autonomy. It's a belief in the discipline of architecture and an interest in the reality that they address. So he's presenting it, puts it under the signs of autonomy and realism, and a few months later, together with Bruno Reichlin, co-edits an issue of Architese, which was a radical journal at this time, entitled Realism in Architecture. So together they write on the problem of inner architectural reality. So again, it's a call to arms, to drop sociological concerns and to look again at architecture as a language, but at the same time, how, you know, interpretation of architectural realism that they go through. Okay, without going into details on this, at the same time I'm going to show you some not very good photographs that I took in the archive of a folder that tells the story of the exhibition, just all the paperwork that was produced. And this is, the exhibition was a huge success. The catalog flew off. It sold out in 2 weeks. The exhibition already, it opened in November, it closed in December. In January, it opened in Lausanne. And at the same time, they were already discussing a second edition because it had sold out in no time. And you see there at the bottom, very large Italian text, French text, English text. So all of a sudden they said, okay, this cannot be only in German, this has to be translated. And at the same time, in the same folders, you see not only Nakamura from A+U, who writes this, you cannot read it there, but it's written the 16th of January, 1976, and saying, following our discussion, so basically he had been at the exhibition and he wanted to publish this project in A+U. And a few months later, Bernard Huet, who was the editor of Architecture d'aujourd'hui at the same time, with a very similar request. So, almost directly transplanted from this exhibition, you start seeing this project in Japanese characters, in French characters. This very important issue for the Ticino architecture of A+U that covers particularly the houses, so this is focused on the one-family houses, and the Martin Steinmann's essay that was translated into English as well as Japanese, and it went on to be published in very important theory anthologies, so it kind of acquired a life of its own. And Architecture d'aujourd'hui, that has in 1977 an issue on formalism, realism, so they take this issue of realism, but they frame it through the concept of la tendenza, which of course referred to the Italian tendenza, but also without making many sort of nuances. Also it extends to tendenza-like projects in Spain, in France, and of course in Ticino. And on the far side there are two articles that are running parallel, one at the top of the page, one is at the bottom of the page. The first one is called Critique d'une exposition, so an exhibition critique, and it's written by Francesco Dalco, who writes a stinker. He hated the exhibition. He's very, very critical. He talks about, any levels of pastiche, of copy-paste, and he denigrates the entire production quite strongly because he puts it quite clearly in the text. He felt that the theoretical basis was actually developed in Italy, and he was upset that it had been applied in Switzerland. Simply understandably. And then Critique d'une critique, where quite nicely, at the same time in parallel, Martin Steinmann and Bruno Reichlin, again, his partner in crime, are given the opportunity to reply to this. And they write, dans la nuit de la critique, tous les chats sont noirs. So basically they say that the critique has the same lack of nuance that a reading of architecture could have. So this is where we come to a protagonist in the audience, that Ticino architecture reaches this level of currency internationally, and at the same time there is a particular step that will throw it much more into the international discourse, and this is the article written by Kenneth Frampton on Mario Botta and the School of the Ticino that was published in Oppositions in 1978. And I'd really like to get to the bottom of how Kenneth got was exposed to this architecture in the first place. But what is interesting is that already by 1978, he talks about Mario Botta as being one of the more important protagonists, so he's kind of extracted out of the collective group, and at the same time that there is such a thing as a school in the Ticino. There's a beautiful article that looks at the buildings in the landscape. It kind of describes programmatically what Botta's attempting to do here, and this particular nuances commentaries referring to Botta's work make their way into his reading of critical regionalism as well. So, particularly with the inclusion of the critical regionalism chapter in the critical history of modern architecture in the second edition of 1985. All of a sudden, Mario Botta's buildings reach a way wider audience than all the others had before. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I see a direct causality between this and the fact that Mario Botta is the only one who gets a solo show at MoMA. And any number of publications, so he becomes a star architect at another level than the others. And what is very interesting in his essay in the MoMA catalog, actually it's not his, it's the curator, Ruud. Yeah. Yes, Stuart Reed.
Yeah.
And Stuart Reed writes about the origins of Botta's thought in his trajectory, having worked for Le Corbusier, Carlo Scarpa, and Louis Kahn. There's not a single beep about Ticino architecture. So he has become a singular figure at this point. And with this singularity, he acquires such a cultural currency that he becomes also politically potent, more than many architects can be. And with this political currency, he can, in 1996, gather enough momentum for the creation of the Accademia di Architettura in Mendrisio in 1997. So this is an actual school of the Ticino that develops from this set of causalities. And in these photographs you can see here, this is Martin Steinmann, this is Aurelio Galfetti. So there is still this network that was established already before the time of the Tendenzen exhibition is still very much in operation here. Not all of the participants of the exhibitions were automatically in the academia, but many were. And in a little parenthesis, in December I was in Hong Kong and I saw the Kenneth Frampton Library there with a wonderful array of the exemplars that had been built, that had been sort of held there with all the translations of the critical history of modern architecture in Chinese and Korean and Japanese and all that. And again, it kind of goes away to see this incredible outreach that through this one book, this architecture acquired. And something else that was very nice in this was this wall of little A4 posters from the 1980s of people who had given lectures there. And the one that I liked best was the cancelled Aldo Rossi of 1980. Lecture that never happened. But what is on the poster of the lecture that never happened is a collage of the Città Analoga, which takes us to the next issue, the excursus of the Alps as a cultural boundary. So Rossi is very aware of the fact that the Alps work as a barrier somehow between Ticino and the rest of, well, actually the rest of Europe. Is actually, he looks at it in a wider sense as a cultural barrier between the south, Italy, and the north. And he describes that to some extent, but it's really about how Ticino sees itself as this kind of in-between territory. And we're very used to see this as the map of the Ticino as this kind of inverted triangle with the lakes, the Great Lakes. But it is in a book of Aldo Rossi that this canton basically is dissolved and it becomes part of a wider cultural territory, which is understood as Lombardy. This is not a political statement. He really refers to culture. And this is something that animates also his interest in Ticino. He produces together with some of his erstwhile assistants and students of ETH in 1979 an amazing book called The Construction of Territory. We're talking about 800 pages, an A4 volume that looks at Ticino with an ethnographic gaze, these wonderful surveys of villages, of typologies, and so on. And on the cover, the same Città Analoga that also appears on the poster. He's very much almost his sort of seal. And this refers to a collage that he had prepared also in collaboration with Geraldo Consolacio, and Fabio Reinhardt, so again his erstwhile assistants at ETH. And it's, there are many articles that look iconographically at this piece and what everything represents. And particularly the lower left has this understanding of the Alps as being an important locus, and you can see here. So this is by the way the Dufour map. So it's the first map of Switzerland that was drawn in the 19th century by General Dufour, and you can see here it's superimposed with one of these wonderful surveys from the book. So there is this sense of separateness and difference, but then what happens is that from these very interesting readings of Martin Steinmann, of Kenneth Frampton, they kind of open the gate to a much wider ranging interest, and soon enough publications appear that cater to this demand, to this curiosity from the political circle. So a Ticino guide that is first written in English and then translated in Italian and German. Then you have books like this Architettura Recente nel Ticino. So there are quite a few of these surveys that just consolidate this chronology of Ticino architecture. And even in the early 2000s, when I first visited Ticino with Jonathan, we could go into a tourist office and get this leaflet that told us where the projects were, and could go and see them. I don't know if the private owners of the houses had given their approval for this catalog, but there it was. So these are just a few of a barrage of publications, both formal and informal. There were many seminar trips, readers being kind of copy-pasted and put together, itineraries for seeing this architecture, but also very many critical readings of different levels of interest and sophistication. And even non-architectural journals such as Do, which is a cultural journal that had at least 2 monographic issues on Ticino in 1980s, 85, 86, both referring at Ticino builders and particularly at the presence of Luigi Snotti as a political agent in this scene. And then you have these kind of books that have normally an introductory essay and then lots of projects, and in between, if you're lucky, you have this kind of narrative of what happened in the 30s, what happened in the 50s, what happened later. And that's kind of how it established and follows pretty much the same genealogy that we saw in 1975 that Snotti had passed on to the organizers of the exhibition. And we see it again in a book that is again produced by non-architects, by the editor of Do. He writes this book called An Architecture of Resistance, and he looks at Ticino architecture, and he describes pretty much the same, he calls it the family tree of Ticino architecture with the same characters. Perhaps very singular among this is a book that's kind of in between formal and informal. It's a huge book, it's about this large, it's very thick, and it's produced by Thomas Boga, who, if you remember, was a designer of the exhibition, and the person who had organized all the traveling exhibitions and hangings afterwards. For about 10 years, he continued working on Tendenzen. And he put together photocopies of all the articles in all the languages that had been published in the meantime. So this becomes really an archive of photocopies that is something, a publication that would be unthinkable today, and probably was unthinkable then because he was a publisher of this, he was self-published. And this is somehow the straw that broke the camel's back, because this is when the Ticinese started saying, this is too much. And if there's anything in my book that I'm really proud about, is that these voices from Ticino that are not so well known sort of reach a wider audience, particularly two. One is Paolo Fumagalli, who was an architect, an editor of a professional journal in Ticino, and then he became an editor of the Verlag and Wohnen in German-speaking Switzerland. And he writes an incredibly critical review of the Thomas Boga, which is basically a rant. And he calls it robbery, and he connects it, interestingly enough, to the Xerox techniques, to the reprographics technique. And he says, just as these articles can be photocopied, or how the plans and the photographs of the building can be photocopied and reused, so is the architecture itself photocopied and reused. And he also puts, for the first time, you actually get the sense of what the Ticino feels about this invasion of interest. We're quite fed up with it. It's a fiction. And actually, and this is what I really like at the end, he said that actually the real Ticino, the one that you cannot put through a Xerox machine, needs to be saved from ecological disaster. So he brings in a completely different dimensions, like political and environmental, and he talks about the fact that this canton is being destroyed by its industrialization. This was not the first time that he was putting his foot down in this. He was, as I said, the editor of a journal called Revista Tecnica, and one issue of Revista Tecnica, instead of having a beautiful photograph of a beautiful project, has quite an arresting image and refers to the pollution in the Val di Maggia, one of the most beautiful valleys in Ticino, and also the proposals, the planning proposals to turn Lugano into a car park. And this becomes a very strong, very polemical issue. This is where actually the image of the poster also comes from. It was drawn by Flora Ruscia-Roncati, who was one of the co-editors of this issue, and she had, many students of hers told me she had this gift of drawing maps by herself, so just from memory, and then with a little question mark in the middle, the Enigma Ticino. A collage of a 4-lane motorway cutting away Lugano from the lake that was being proposed. The effects of extraction in the Val di Muggia, and actually this had a political effect because this 4-lane motorway was voted down. So Fumagalli was involved very much in covering this architecture in parallel with what was happening internationally, but in a much more local and low-key way. And another person who was involved in this was somebody who was involved with heritage, and he was not an architect at all, he was a historian, Virgilio Gilardoni, who was really in many ways the intellectual lighthouse for intellectuals of a leftist orientation in Ticino at this time. Also not mincing his words and not afraid of being sort of politically marginalized because of his opinions. But what he says that's very interesting is that what is known as Ticino architecture internationally is actually a very small proportion of what is built, and a lot of what is built is not okay, and it's not good, and it's not a it does not deserve the same admiration. And the other thing that he says is that, in a way, the political ambitions of the architects at this point are not fitted. They do not fit with the historical conditions in which they are placed. They cannot create a revolutionary Red Vienna, he writes. They can only create bourgeois houses for one family of engineers and professionals. So they create very, very pertinent commentaries to what was happening. And approaching to an end to this, and without going into the theories of autonomy of realism, what I'd like to talk a little bit is about the fact that there is a certain design method that somehow originates perhaps in the Italian Tendenza, that perhaps is adopted and implemented in Ticino, But at the same time, it has a manifestation in the US. It has a manifestation in the sort of the students of these people, of Luigi Snozzi, for example, at ETH Zurich. We have our own scene in London, and it's really wonderful to be here to remind ourselves of this, and the wonderful discussion had this morning with Tony Fratton about a London school that was opening towards a European expression, a European architectural culture, not competitive, not sort of a step in a trajectory, in parallel, bringing in its own characteristics and empiricism, but a contribution. And another one is perhaps what has been happening in Belgium in the last 20 years or so. So all in all, what we see is a to and fro between practice, between buildings, and between publications, and the way that they kind of enter a cycle in which they inform and feed each other. And the buildings that results from experiments generate their own theoretical readings, and at the same time, theory, because it represents a certain projection, acquires a certain autonomy. Whereas the built architecture remains always heterogeneous. It's very difficult to actually create, these labels are killing people who are writing about architecture, because it's very difficult to find them. Okay, so I'm just going to leave you with this to and fro between practice and theory. And just as a way of closing, I'm going to announce that there will be an exhibition at ETH Zurich in exactly 50 years after the original Tendenzen. And as part of this exhibition, I'm organizing a call for catalogs. So if you know anyone who has some of the Tendenzen catalogs, we'd be very interested in knowing that and learning them for the exhibition, and just as a way of mapping and showing the dissemination of this phenomenon way outside of certainly Ticino and certainly Switzerland. Okay, I'll leave you with this, and thank you so much for your attention.
Irina, thank you so much. In the spirit of dialogue, opportunity for people to ask you questions, and with Ken and others here tonight, maybe to rekindle this narrative, or extend this narrative, and so on. So well, at least I wasn't going to start by asking a question. I thought more interesting, a large room of very interesting people. So if people would like to ask a question, do please.
The good news is that you don't have to read the book anymore.
I mean, I've read the book, and everybody should read the book. Everybody should read the book. It's an amazing condensation, as it were, of the question of practice and theory. I mean, that seems to me what starts out as this kind of narrative that evolves out of this way of putting a group of architects work together, and the kind of self-imposed constraints of publication and exhibition, and how this isn't really a question. But anyway, the thing being that what starts out as this kind of evolution of practice and theory into these autonomous things actually turns into a kind of critical reflection, it seems to me, on the question of actually how architects practice. So it seems absolutely relevant as a reflection on what we are all involved in every day, and how we square the way we might represent our work and how our work may be represented, how we talk about it and others talk about it. And I suppose because you talk about things like methodologies, and this question to which, I mean, I tread carefully because this is your thesis, but it seems to me that one of the things is this question of to what extent, maybe this is sort of a question, to what extent do you need to edit out and disassociate work for it to become meaningful and relevant or far wider audience geographically. I mean, do you think that's a
tragedy, yes.
Yeah.
If all the theoretical readings would have retained the grain and the level of detail that still connected these readings to what was happening, nobody would have been interested. Because it's all so bound with the politics of Ticino and this little region, and this politician said yes, and these votes, and these referendums, and this school reform, not interested. Whereas if you come from the outside and say, this is about architectural autonomy, this is about architectural realism, like Steinman did, everybody pricks their ears, particularly with issues like autonomy and realism, which I've been writing about for 15 years maybe, and maybe longer, and it's very difficult to define them. It's not like I could stand here and give you a definition of architectural realism or architectural autonomy, because there are so many. So this particular, there are certain notions that have very different understandings depending on who's using them. They always have to be requalified. So when somebody comes and uses them with a certain confidence and says this architecture is about that, then that would be attractive because it feeds on people saying, oh, so this is what architectural autonomy is. Now I get it. So I think that a certain sort of very basic level, of course, I'm not being a sociologist or anthropologist in terms of telling how people think, but I think that this is part of it. It's a principle of IKEA, you know, pack it flat and it will travel.
And having read the book, you know, that's exactly what I was convinced of. But I then also just wondering whether in the current sort of, I'm not sure if theory is the right word, but there are certain concerns in practice that do make me start to think that people are desperately trying to situate what they do. Well, on one level, it's quite a sophisticated way, and another level, actually people want to talk about sort of very specific people involved and the places, and I wonder therefore to what extent this stuff does have that freedom to travel, as you say. There's lots of ways that people, I feel, are describing their work now, which doesn't flat back.
And I think that's right. You should not necessarily flat back.
But there's
it's a quid pro quo.
Good and bad, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Can I ask you, in curating the new exhibition at 50, are you addressing or picking up some of the critics' comments that you've observed?
Well, I'm looking at the concept of influence and how the architectural discourse is propelled to some extent by that. So I try to extract from it, not to look at just glorifying an event that happened 50 years ago that doesn't seem enough for today or relevant today, but to understand how influence operates, both in terms of coverage of buildings and the readings, the commentaries in the written word. It's something that is worth unpacking. So this is what we're trying to do. But at the same time, it's very much looking at the original materials. There's a certain fetishism of paper that really comes across when you go into an archive and you think this looks so fantastic, this material. So there is a bit of that, but also there is an attempt to understand how architectural knowledge travels. And one of the things that, for example, is happening is the act of translation. Particularly, it's not accidental that the people who are very in-depth commentators in Ticino were published in Italian and were only locally known. If they had been published, translated, and published by journals of international circulation, then maybe people would have looked differently at it. But only now we come back 50 years later, or in that case 30 or 40 years later, and think, yes, these commentaries make a lot of sense, and now we're talking much more about the local and causalities at the more sort of micro scale, in a way that maybe then it was considered not so important. So we just trying to do this a little bit and to tease out these nuances.
You talk about the politics. I mean, I was a student of Snodsy in the early 80s. It was my first experience in Lausanne, and Snodsy came in by force because he was kept away from teaching because of his political belief. He was part of the political Travaillist Communist Party, basically. And there was a sense at the time that actually it was an architecture, in a way, resistance, but it was about repair, about small projects, seeing the global view of a territory, and I'm thinking about the Bellinzona changing room, for example, which is an act of repair of a valley cut in half by the motorway. So it's an incredibly powerful project. It's not completed because it stops before the motorway. But there was this notion that any small project, and maybe because of Botta talks about typology and looks at using, all our projects were in Ticino, in small villages, but there was always this idea that actually you should always look at the bigger picture, which is the whole territory. But it seems to me that there was a strong political undertone, which obviously Botta betrayed or left, focused on something quite different in a way. I mean, what's your thought about the political context at that time?
I think many of these people, I mean, I haven't studied them a lot individually, but those ones that I have, of course, we know that Carboni and Snodsy were making a very strong point about being members of the Comunista Autonoma. Autonoma again, so good for the architects. Flora Ruchat was very much of the left, Galfetti too, and you can also see it in this project, the Bagno di Bellinzona, which is such a generous project. Snodsy was not only a committed communist, because he was also very happy to work for bourgeois clients and do all these wonderful private houses that he did. But he was an exceedingly good teacher, from what I understand. And there are people like, of course, very deeply influenced by him, like Roger Dina. And in the catalogue, there's a selection of architects who are asked to write about the project, and some are completely, they kind of, what do I do? This is not my job. My job is to design. How do I write? And very different attitudes come across. Some people are kind of pragmatic and they just provide project descriptions. Some are programmatic in a kind of rhetorical way, like Botta. Some absolutely hate being asked to write, and basically they write an essay saying, I don't write, I design, I don't write, I don't like writing, And then Snodsy, among all of them, is the one who puts out very clearly 4 points of an architecture, the relationship to the city, typology, and so on and so forth, history. It's very, very clear and very programmatic, and you can see that is a teacher. He is actually writing about what he was teaching his students. So politics was not bearing directly on this, in this particular situation. Also, I think that the positions were openly, heterogeneous. It was not an ideological project. And you can see the ideological projects emerging later in the directions that they took.
Monte Carlo is a political project.
Absolutely, but that came afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
No, absolutely. Ideology is present, but it's not explicit in this particular moment.
Yeah, I think Switzerland is a very, very interesting place culturally. And actually just recently I was looking at a small practice in Geneva, in fact. And what they're able to achieve is really quite remarkable. Largely because of the city. And I think that your book makes me very aware of this, the increased wealth of the Ticino, and then this need for schools and building these schools. This is also coming from bourgeois family, of course, from middle class family that have and want to send their children to, etc., etc. So I think there is a kind of very delicate issue involved, between middle class bourgeois patronage and a certain kind of progressive politics. And I think it's a very kind of disturbing thing about Britain is that there is not a middle class that is. Middle class is not really not a patronage of the middle class for architecture. I mean, it's really very striking that it just doesn't really exist. Here and there maybe, but basically there are not many middle class houses, modern middle class houses being built that have that create a culture. And so I think the advantage of Switzerland is this cantonal tradition and the idea that within the canton a particular culture can be created, and in a way it is an educated middle class that is doing that. And that's a political, cultural advantage that Switzerland has compared to this country, even Mexico.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And the other thing I wanted to say is that before 81 is when the term critical realism was coined, and but I was going there anyway. Because when this brief period when I was editing the magazine Architectural Design with Monica Pippin, of course, but basically, the person who was so-called technically editor had enormous. She basically, she was very, very generous, and basically she was very kind of cooperative in moving the magazine. And so at some point, Joseph Brickworth writes a piece about Gino Valli in Udine, and I was very attracted to that. This again, small, a place where, I had this kind of thing in my head, which was a total myth, but kind of, as I like to put it, a necessary myth, that certain architects like Ernst Giesler in Zurich and Oswald Matthias Ungers in Cologne had a kind of identification with the society in some way. That there was a response to them. Of course, it's partly mythic. It's in my head. Is that real? I don't think it was too real. But anyway, it was a necessary myth for me. But this is long before the term critical regionalism is coined, because that's 81. And I remember an embarrassing moment in the Netherlands when Alex Zonis is a very, very kind of polemical gesture, writes in block letters critical regionalism on the blackboard, and then crosses out certain pieces of the thing to make architectural realism. He turns the whole thing into realism on the spot. A funny experience. And anyway,
I really struggle with that. Yeah.
What?
The relation between realism and critical regionalism, it really, it has been unpacked, I'm sure.
Yes, well, it's obviously a move to try and kind of be more rigorous in a way. Right? This is drive towards what is that? Realism, to make it more rigorous, to realism, which I completely understand that.
We still need it.
Pardon?
We still need it.
Yes, well, I think, my interest in poetics of construction, for example, is really kind of also the same thing, in a way. And anyway, But Switzerland is a very privileged place, I think.
Oh, yeah.
From this point of view of you know, a relatively small community. And one other thing I wanted to say is that I think, you know, the idea of a city-state, which is also very weak in this country. You know, the cities don't have that sense of identity that they have in Italy or in Spain or in Switzerland. They just don't have that sense of identity. You know, and it's a big problem, I think. Politically, it's a huge problem. And also, of course, in the States, it's a vast problem as well. This lack of any kind of direct democracy, you know, that would become evident to people what they are voting about. You know. And a Swiss friend of mine took me, well, we were in Glarus, and there is this kind of res publica in Glarus, where the canton the commune comes there, having and actually votes for certain by the hand.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Direct democracy.
Yeah, well, it has many advantages, but without identifying a city, you know, and understanding what is its destiny. I mean, it begins here, of course, because of the weakness of the centre. I mean, in Manchester and so on, it's something beginning, but there's not a big tradition to build on, I don't think. Yeah. And Margaret Thatcher, of course, just really destroyed the city, but went out of her way to do it.
Yeah, that is another history.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
So, you know, it is what Switzerland is able to do. Of course, it's partly it's a rather prosperous place. It's the other aspect.
Yes. But you know what's very nice, and if you do read the book, there's lots of things that I didn't mention. I will be here till tomorrow. But one of the things is they talk about the pettiness of the architects becoming, you know, jealous of each other, competing for a diminishing pool of competitions, and that's it's part of the process. It's something that all practicing architects are familiar with.
Yes, well, of course.
Well, thank you so much. Any other questions or comments?
Well, there's one other thing I want to say, which is the importance of Vittorio Ghigotti. Territory of architecture, fundamentally important. And, you know, the early eco-politics with Lausanne competitions clearly to do with the territory of architecture. And then the beautiful bathing facility by Tessin. Incredible.
The theoretical baggage was basis, not baggage, was definitely in Italy, and that's why Rossi's comment was one that made sense, that actually you can't separate just into political and administrative. Ticino is separate from Italy. It was actually a cultural unit, and then the other cultural unit was separated by the Alps.
Yeah.
So it also creates a sense of self-understanding.
Yes.
Just as a last thing to say, or another question?
Yes, just a very small comment, and thanks for the lecture, Irina. It was wonderful, the sense of the archive coming alive on the screen. And you really know it. So it's kind of,
Well, there's nothing nicer than younger people being released to work on this archive and saying,
wow.
I know, I can get photographs of this, I can get, and this is what happened.
Incredibly curious about the exhibitions that you are sort of planning this year, and how you sort of reenact an exhibition after 50 years. How do you relate to it in the present?
That terrifies me. Overnight. But hopefully I'll have an answer by October. Before that, hopefully. Just as a thank you, Joanna. Just as a last thing, there are 10 copies in the office that were kind of the publisher who said, they sold out, I don't have any more copies. But we're reprinting them in February, so they're going to be available again. But then they found in a box somewhere 10 copies, so if anybody's interested, they're there at the back, and I think there's something like 20 copies. I'm sorry, so many friends that I like to just throw them in the audience, but I have to answer to the publisher for these 10 copies. So if anybody's interested, please let me know.
It's a very nice book, great book.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Like just before there's a mad rush to tinkle, say thank you again, Irina. Thank you very much. I mean, testament to your storytelling, the existence of the archive, extracting the information out of the archive. I mean, I think it is really unusual, having read it, to read a historiography, which, you know, it is more than, you're doing more than telling, as it were, your story. It's not, I think it's fair to say, it's not your point of view, it's more sort of clinical in its kind of unpicking and explaining something which, I suppose, in a way, perhaps we were all led to take for granted. So I just found that incredibly unusual. And I sort of sense as a method of reflection and critical writing that it has huge relevance for practice and theory, sort of worldwide, and sort of wonderful read. So thank you very much.
Thank you.